This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. I'm an independent curator specializing in prints and printmaking. This is Series 3 of Platemark, which features interviews with the wide variety of people that occupy the print ecosystem. Today's guest is curator Ruth Fine, who I worked with at the National Gallery back in the 90s. Her career at the National Gallery of Art was amazing. 40 years worth, in fact. And it wasn't so long ago that she retired. But since then, she's been working on all sorts of interesting projects and has an exhibition coming up at the Phillips Collection in the summer featuring photographs by Frank Stewart. So we talk about that, but we talk about all sorts of other things too. I hope you'll enjoy the episode. Let me see, a little bit of housekeeping, my positionality. I identify as a cis-het white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Images that Ruth and I talk about will be available over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. There's also a support and donate button. Help me keep the lights on. I appreciate it. And what else? I think that's it. Buckle up and let's get rolling. Ruth, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark.
It's my pleasure to join you.
It's great to see you. Can you introduce yourself for the listeners?
I'm Ruth Fine, and I was the curator at the National Gallery for 40 years and then a few on contract. And before that, I taught studio art for about 10 years on a university level. And after that, I've been working independently. I left Washington and now live in Philadelphia and still do exhibitions and research, and mainly print related, but not totally print related.
So you and I met when I was a young whippersnapper at the National Gallery back in the day, although I wasn't in your department. Mm-hmm. But 40 years is a long time at an institution.
Well, I had really three or four totally different jobs. My first 8 years were with Lessing Rosenwald's collection outside of Philadelphia. That was from 1972 to 1980. Lessing Rosenwald died in 1979. Took us between 1979 and 1980 to close down Alverthorpe Gallery, which was the home of his collection. His collection was given to the National Gallery in spurts, so that I was working for the National Gallery while I was at his collection. The first spurt was when the gallery opened in 1941, a small number of prints. In 1943, he gave most of his prints and drawings collection to the National Gallery and his rare book collection to the Library of Congress. But at that time, it was possible to maintain lifetime ownership in your own property. You didn't have to actually turn it over. That changed, I believe, in 1967, at which point, if you made a donation, you had to turn it over. If you made a partial donation, you lent it to the museum or gave it to the museum for whatever part of the year covered the part you had donated. But until 67, he pretty much kept most everything at Alverthorpe. Some things went to the National Gallery, but I don't think too many. And then I went to the National Gallery, and we were all curators without special designations, but I essentially was modern prints and drawings and was really the first curator of modern prints and drawings, as I recall, even before I was called that. And I forget what year we were given departmental designations, but at that point I became curator of modern prints and drawings. And that lasted until about 2003, when I became curator of special projects in modern art. And that lasted until 2012, until sometime in 2013, I was on a contract basis working on specific projects.
So what listeners may not know about the setup at the National Gallery is that the modern prints and drawings department is completely separate from the other older materials and Western European. And so there's I mean, you were under the same umbrella, but did you feel like you had more autonomy because you were separated physically?
Well, there were a few moves. We were, and I'm afraid I'm not going to remember the exact time frame,
Oh,
but for
that's
most
okay.
of the time we were in the West Building and the old master prints were in the East Building. And then I think it may have changed some so that American prints and drawings were in the West Building and European prints and drawings were in the East Building. Basically, the gallery was modeled on the British National Gallery, and its collections were of Western European and American art. I mean, not that the British National Gallery was high on American art, but we did American art since we were the American National Gallery. Autonomy. We met frequently as a unit. I felt a certain amount of autonomy, but I always knew I was part of a larger department because we did meet frequently and discuss projects that the other side was doing. And so I never felt isolated, if that's a clearer answer to the question.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's separate to the point where Modern Prints and Drawings has their own study room to host classes. So that I always felt like the National Gallery was like Manhattan. The East Building was the Upper East Side, and the West Building was the Upper West Side. And you could wear jeans on the West Side, but you had to wear a suit on the East Side.
Well, it depended whether it was a board meeting day or a regular.
Right.
If the dress code changed from one side to the other, then there was a certain formality at the National Gallery that probably is less so now. And I did design the West Building print room. At a certain point, we got space saver shelving and very large, specially designed flat files to maintain works that were the size that works were becoming. I mean, Lessing Rosenwald had no interest in photo-oriented art, and he had specific size drawers, and he wasn't interested in acquiring anything that was larger than those drawers. And so that was a limitation on what he acquired. He acquired early Tamarin prints. So he did, while he started in the 15th century, he went up to the 20th. And whoever was curator there was, curator of the entire collection. And for most of my time there was not anyone working for the Library of Congress specifically, so that I really was overseeing the Library of Congress collection as well as the National Gallery collection. That changed shortly before he died. But one of the more interesting things was going to the FBI building, because they were the only place in Washington we could find space saver shelving to look at. And the first time I went there, they couldn't find them. They were well hidden. And so I had to go back a second time, which was amusing. They did find them the second time.
I remember those space saver units. They were incredible, but I always felt like, gosh, if I'm standing there and I get squished in between them, like you couldn't stop that thing if it, as you rolled it along.
They were not electrical. I didn't consider electrical moving shelving. I only considered handwork shelving that you had to, grind around and get. So, you could get out. And, we were a small enough staff that we knew if somebody else was in the storage area. And so I don't think that ever happened to anybody.
No,
Everybody got squeezed into the space saver housing. But, I think storage over the years became a larger, complicated problem. But I guess I was involved with the first major cache of contemporary prints, which was the Gemini GEL archive. And that came to the gallery about 1980. I started going out to Gemini even while I was still working in Philadelphia, so that became my focus while I was still at the Rosenwald Collection. And then when I went to the National Gallery, there were several old master curators of prints and drawings. Andrew Robinson and Diane Russell and Diane DeGrazia were all dealing with old master material. And they really had nobody who had been dealing with contemporary or modern material per se. So that was pretty obvious that that would become my world, which was fine, of course. I loved that.
Right. The deal with Gemini wasn't that one of every last thing came, that you were going and selecting
No, with
spots for?
Gemini, aside from sculpture editions, and I can't remember at what point I think we did become more selective. I think possibly a large Noguchi sculpture project may have been the first time we didn't take one of everything, but one of every work produced at Gemini came to the National Gallery, and I believe still does. And what was quite wonderful is I'm not a particularly tech-oriented person, but I did oversee the first digital catalog the National Gallery did, or maybe the first digital print catalog, I'm not sure, which was the Gemini GEL online catalog raising. I knew enough to oversee what was being done, but it was basically based on the worksheets that Gemini produced for every edition, which gave all of the information. Most of the major printmaking workshops did give worksheets that told the size of the edition, the media, the printers, the assistant printers, the date started, the date finished, how many proofs.
Right. Very helpful.
So that's helpful in doing
Yeah.
work on a catalog raisonné, of course.
Sure. You have managed other catalogs, raisonné.
I, along with Elizabeth Glassman at that time, the head of the O'Keeffe Foundation, we co-oversaw the Georgia O'Keeffe catalog raisonné, and I oversaw the Lichtenstein print catalog raisonné with Mary Lee Corlett doing the entries. I did the introductions, and both of us met with Roy Lichtenstein. Unfortunately, he was around, and we talked about all sorts of things that had to do with the organization of that catalog. And I also, while I was still in Philadelphia, oversaw with Robert Looney the catalog raisonné of Ben Spruance's prints, because the key set of his prints was at the Free Library of Philadelphia. And he was a very close friend of Lessing Rosenwald and an important lithographer. Nationally, at that time, he's become more important internationally as interest in American art has increased. So that was the first catalog raisonné I was involved with.
I always wonder, how would you approach a catalog raisonné if you don't have a key set of, the information or the sheets from the printers, or like it's the people who tackle artists that have hodgepodge record keeping, like Hayter, for instance. I don't know how you would do it.
Well, I never have.
Smart woman.
You spread as wide a net as you can. You do as much advertising as you can. Usually you have something to start with. You have studio records or dealer records, and they're always very important. And sometimes it's very important to give the corresponding numbers. I chair the board of the Lichtenstein Foundation now, and we're working on a catalog raisonné of all of Lichtenstein's art. So the sculpture, the drawings, the paintings, the prints are going to be incorporated. And we did have good records, studio records, but the more records you have, the more conflicting information you're going to have. And one of the things we spend a huge amount of time, I work closely with Jack Howard, who chairs the foundation, and Andrea Tail, who is overseeing the catalog at this point. And we spend a lot of time, discussing how best to explain something, and how best to explain how you organize something, why you organize something, why you call something, what you're including, what you're not including, why you're including it, why you're not including it. So a great deal of work when a serious catalog raisonné has to do as much with how you're organizing it. And for me, I've always felt that if you explain what you're doing well enough, then you can pretty much do whatever seems right to you. And every one of them is different, I mean, no two catalog raisonnés that I'm aware of have the same demands. Every artist is different. And so each one is unique. And so it's a never ending, interesting thing to think about. I mean, I don't feel like the thinking I did on any of the earlier ones, including Roy's, matters as Andrea, Jack, and I talk about what's happening with the Lichtenstein online catalog. It will have all of the works we're aware of. It will not have all of the information about all of the works in the first version, but we're hoping to get it up in October of this year, 2023, because this is the centennial of his birth. And so that's our target date.
Nice.
The closer you get to the target date, the more terrified you get about having the information you want for phase one.
Right.
Huge project. Huge.
Well, right. Yeah. So, and it's online only. There's no printed book for this
There
version.
is not at this point. We're not thinking about a printed version at all.
Were those discussions? I mean, I would assume that would be a big discussion.
Always discussions. The advantage, I think, of a printed version is you know what's there on the date it's printed, and anything else comes later. The advantage of an online version is that you can update, make changes, add, but we all feel it's very important to have a sense of what exists at the time the original version is published, and that it will be important to find ways to demonstrate any new information that's added so that you still have a set date for what was known when. I wouldn't say what was true when, but what was known when. And the language as far as we know today, or that kind of information based on current research, how do you verbalize it?
Right.
But the useful thing is that you can update it. And I think probably we will want to think about, how long a period do we want to see that it's overseen to be updated? The foundation itself plans to sunset, so we will want someone else to be doing the updating. My feeling is it will be whoever does the updating will have a great research project for students if it's a university situation, or for interns if it's a museum situation, because you have to consider so many things. And of course, provenance changes all the time. And as tools get improved for determining media, that may change. So there's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, but the idea of the Lichtenstein Foundation sunsetting is built in. It was built into the formation of it in the beginning, I'm sure. But then if you've got this gigantic database floating out there, technology changes, keeping the code useful, technically useful, I hope there's like some legacy, budget line for,
that's plan.
Yeah,
sure. That's what's necessary, is finding the right place and how, and having the funding for that, of course. When you're sunsetting, you spend a lot of time thinking about what funds do you need moving forward.
Right.
So that's one of the things we think about.
Right. Which isn't really sunsetting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in my mind, sunsetting is like closing down shutting the doors and walking away,
No, I think it's really cutting back substantially and probably distributing the art that the foundation may have and being sure that that has good homes. But there are technical issues that will come up. The archives of the foundation and the Lichtenstein estate both will be going to the Archives of American Art. And so they will keep track of the changes in technology, of course.
Right.
And they're so great at we will have digitized everything by the time it's turned over, but using the techniques and strategies that the archives itself would use. Our foundation archivist, Justin Brancato, was a long-term employee of the Archives of America. So we're very connected to his knowledge.
Right. It's important. Archivists rule.
Certain aspects of the world, they certainly do.
Yeah, exactly. They're keepers of the knowledge. Yeah, and I'm not sure that we've on Platemark talked about the Archives of American Art, but it's an invaluable resource, and there's all sorts of good stuff in there that researchers can go and dig through. And I feel like it should be, I'm sure it's well used, but hopefully the listeners out there will be like, oh, hey, I should go check those people out, because I found some great stuff in there. In the Fred Becker papers, I was trying to write an essay on Fred Becker one time, who worked with Hayter in the early days, and boy, there were some letters between he and Hayter that could, raised your hair. I was like, woo!
No, the archives is an amazing facility. I've used it throughout my professional career. My papers are there. My late husband's papers are there. And I think everybody should put their papers there. And they've had special initiatives in recent years. They've had initiative to expand their African American artists' archives, but they've been collecting artists of color archives from the very beginning. And they have had a Latinx specialization, but they've been doing all of this from the beginning. I mean, they've really been totally open to all aspects of American art from their inception. And they're very helpful. And increasingly, their papers are getting digitized. Various people have donated funding. The Terra Foundation, I don't know if they donated the initial funding, but they donated a large amount of money to expand funding over 2 periods of time. I'm not on the Terra Foundation anymore, so I don't really know what's happening now. But on the years I was on that board, we felt that the digitization of the archives at the Archives of American Art was among the most important things one could do for American art. And I think that's proven to be true. Then they're used internationally, of course.
Yeah. Back in the 2019, maybe it was, the Terra Foundation funded an exhibition in Sao Paulo, Brazil, on Hayter and modernist prints and the exchange between, Latin America and the States and Europe. And I went down there for the opening and this symposium, and what became super clear listening to the various scholars from Brazil and one from Buenos Aires was that there is no centralized archive of artists' papers in Brazil at all. Like for modernism, you still have to find the great aunt or the great, niece or whoever, and you have to really sort of dig and dig and dig. And it just highlighted how incredible the American archives are. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was supposed to go to that. I don't remember why I didn't.
You were supposed to come.
I wrote a paper, I believe.
You did.
Somebody delivered.
Taylor Poland did.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, Taylor delivered your paper. It was wonderful. Yeah, no, it was a good trip. We had a good time.
Yeah, no, I forget why I couldn't go, but
I can't remember.
Important conference. Mexico is as far south as I've been. Very early on, I was in Mexico twice in the 60s, 1964 and 1965, which was before the Olympics, and I've always rather felt the Olympics altered Mexico, although the climate issues and the air quality issues existed in 64 and 65. We drove there. And
what?
Both summers from Philadelphia, my first husband and I, and they were amazing trips.
What were you doing down there? Making art, I assume.
Well, the first summer we drove pretty much all over the country. We flew to the Yucatan, but other than that, we drove everywhere we went, and it was really just to get a sense of the country. And the second summer, we did stay in one place. We had the use of a home in Cuernavaca that belonged to the family of a relative of my first husband, who was the artist Leonard Lehrer. And he arranged through his family. And so we had this amazing home. It's great. In those days, I even managed to pass for Spanish if I didn't talk too much, which was fun.
I wish I knew Spanish better. Yeah.
I picked it up, basically.
Yeah.
I had studied French, and a lot that we picked up by going to American, US-based movies with subtitles in Mexico. And so I learned a lot of Spanish that way.
Wow.
It was interesting.
All right. Well, this is a great segue into the fact that people may not know that you're an artist and a scholar of prints. So can you tell us about your work? Are you still making things?
I always made things. I always felt that as a curator of the National Gallery, I didn't want to set up any possibility of conflicts of interest. So I've pretty much worked underground from the time I went to the Rosenwald Collection. I had a few shows in far off small places that I don't think anybody ever knew about, and I used the pseudonym for a couple of exhibitions. My own work usually involved prints and paintings and drawings. I was not involved with three-dimensional art, and I wasn't involved with video or other things like that. And I still work. I really never, I think I stopped for several years at the beginning of my time as a curator, thinking that there were a lot of artists in the world, and if I didn't really feel the need to work, then I didn't need to work. And at a certain point, I absolutely found the need to work, and so I got back to work. And so I would say there was probably a 5-year period I didn't work, and it was always not consistent. I worked when I could or was in a place. I've always worked from the landscape. And so when I was working, for example, on the Gemini show, I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, and I would take extra time to work on my own work after my work for Gemini was finished. And I did an exhibition with Elizabeth Glassman of Georgia O'Keeffe's library and spent, a month in Santa Fe and did a lot of small drawings there. I don't work well from photographs. Usually, I draw in a place and then I do a drawing from a drawing and a drawing from another drawing. And so that's how I work. And I would just add on to trips. And I suppose I still do that up to a point. But right now I've been so involved with several projects that this is one of my fallow periods. I started a print edition maybe a year ago, and I have the first proofs, and I'm not getting back to them. And I'm not really trying to. I draw, but I'm not trying to work on any major projects that involve other people right now because I'm working on things that are keeping me very, very busy.
Right. Yeah. So if people know you, they will know that your second husband was Larry Day, the artist, who I met when we were at the National Gallery together. I think you had a birthday party for him at your house in Tacoma Park, and the whole department came, which I think was the only time I ever met him. Also an artist like you. You put together an exhibition of his work that recently was on view a year ago, is it right? For the Wood Mirror?
I didn't really put it together. I ended up doing more than I would have done or intended to do because of COVID. The curator of the show was the English art historian David Bindman, who has been a fellow at Harvard's Hutchins Center for African and African American Art for many years. And he knew Larry well, and Larry always had an affinity for English artists as well. So I asked David if he would consider doing it, and he was very happy to do it. And so he was the curator. The exhibition was in 3 places. The main venue was Woodmere Art Museum in Philadelphia. The second venue was University of the Arts in downtown Philadelphia. It was where I went to school and where Larry taught. And the third venue was what's now called Arcadia University, which was Beaver College, which was another place I taught. Architectural work and prints were at Beaver College, and the print function being there made sense because that's where Benton Spruance had taught. So there's a big component of interest in printmaking there. And representational works and primary section of drawings were at Woodmere. I'm not sure if I said that at the University of the Arts were abstract works, early work. He started as a figurative artist. He then, during a certain period, became abstract expressionist with, I would say, strongest connections to de Kooning and Guston, whom he knew, although his closest friend among that group was Franz Klein. There's a beautiful catalog that was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, and it includes, it doesn't reproduce everything that was in the show, but it reproduces most of what was in the show with all three venues integrated. But because of COVID, David couldn't come over. He came over once, and I took him to see as much as possible. And then he couldn't come over, so I had to send things back and forth, and we had lots of email conversations that wouldn't have been necessary if he was here.
Right.
So I don't feel like I organized it, but it took my time. I had all the records. At that point, all of Larry's archives were in my apartment. Now, most of them are at the Archives of American Art.
Right.
I still have boxes I'm piecing together of his and mine to send down to Washington.
There's a video online of you giving a talk at Woodmere.
Oh, okay.
Surprise.
Yeah, I don't really know what's on.
And there's also one of you walking through the exhibition with T.K. Smith.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which was wonderful. But what struck me about watching the two of them was that when you're a widow and your husband isn't an artist and doesn't have an exhibition done about his work and his life, there's probably not really a place where you stop and reflect on the person himself, but also your relationship and, whatever else. And that listening to you talk about his work was really, in some ways, you were kind of a removed curator, but also every now and again, I was like, they were married, it was this wonderful opportunity for you to really dig in and share the amazing and wonderful work that he made, but also what a wonderful and fabulous partner he had been for you.
Well, it was an interesting project. First of all, I met Larry when I was 19, and we didn't get married until I was 42. So, I had a whole life before we were married. And so I always felt like I wasn't exactly the ordinary artist's widow, in the sense that I did have I fell in love with the man after I fell in love with the art. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
The easiest way to put it. But TK is such a smart young scholar that he gave very interesting questions. And I learned a lot about Larry in doing it. I mean, he always talked about his year in Europe. And I never particularly looked at his passports until the show was being worked on. I did the chronology for the show. Well, there never was a year in Europe. He was in Europe for about 4 months, I think. I mean, I can't remember now the exact length of time, but there was never a year in Europe. He went maybe in the summer and came back in October, and that was based on the passport. But, if you work on artists as long as I have, that their memories are not always accurate. And about anything, I used to say, if you can get the same story 3 times, then it's true. If you can get it 3 times separately from people that you're talking to at different times in different places, if you hear the same thing, then trust it. Otherwise, don't trust it. It may be true. But, always cite the source of what you're saying, and according to so-and-so, this is the case, rather than this happened, because you don't know. But what was also wonderful for me, there were a lot of oral histories made, and what came out of them very consistently from everybody, no matter when they knew Larry or how they knew Larry, was that he taught them how to think. Mm-hmm. And that made a lot of sense. He was certainly one of the best read people I've ever met in the humanities, history, art history, music, and philosophy, and art and aesthetics. He had a huge record collection. His records on jazz I donated to the Columbia University Center for Jazz Studies. And they were thrilled to have him, not only for the music, but for the rappers, for the text, that the texts were very important. His library was extraordinary. And, you know, he didn't get married till he was 64. And so he spent a lot of time in the studio reading, listening to music. So it was just interesting to hear how many people would say that. I was just erasing old telephone messages that had been on my phone. I erased about 100 telephone messages in the last week. Someone said, well, you said you wanted to talk to about Larry. I don't know what I can say about him except that I really loved him. It was nice to hear. And that's what most people said, you know. He was the least judgmental human being I ever knew. I only heard him say once in all the years I knew him that he disliked somebody.
Oh.
Which is pretty astonishing.
Oh.
Only once. And that doesn't mean he liked everybody.
Right, of course.
He never said he disliked anybody but one person.
And I heard you say in one of those videos that everything he said he meant, and he didn't say a lot because he only said what he meant. Was that how you put it? I forget how you put it.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was quieter rather than loquacious, I would say.
Right.
And
right.
He thought about everything.
Yeah.
And said what he felt needed to be said. I mean, he had a wonderful sense of humor, and he was an actor at some point. And he was actually apparently a quite good actor. This was long before I met him. It was when he first got out of art school. But I think that's where his sense of performance took place, which later had a much quieter tone as a teacher. He loved teaching. He was not one of those people who taught to earn a living. I don't think he made any separation between his life as a teacher and his life as an artist. He would talk to his students about what he was doing and what he thought was important, and they would talk to him about what they were doing and what they thought were important. And he always treated them as equals. He saw them as younger artists rather than as students, I would say.
Was he teaching graduate students primarily, or was it undergraduate?
Primarily
also?
Undergraduate. For several years, he was in the graduate department at Penn. But he taught at the University of the Arts, PCA. I think it was 38 years.
Oh, my heavens.
He also, he and I were, I was at the gallery 40 years. He was at UArts 38.
So you have a current project that we need to get to, which is not print related, people. So, you know, it's okay. There are other things happening in the world besides prints.
No, my project, photographs are prints.
Oh, well, okay, all right.
I have two projects that I'm working on, but the one that's taken place over the last 5 years or so has been, more than that, has been a catalog for an exhibition titled Frank Stewart's Nexus, an American photographer's journey, 1960s to the present. And that opens at the Phillips Collection on June 10th is the public opening, as a beautiful catalog that was published by Rizzoli and is available. It will be both at the primary Phillips Collection, and they also now have a space called the Arc that is, I think, in Southeast, which is a community-related workspace and exhibition space. And so the exhibition will be there, and there will be programming there. And Frank his first photographs were made at the time of the March on Washington using his mother's camera. And he was the lead photographer for Jazz at Lincoln Center for about 30 years. And when COVID came about, the staff basically remained the orchestra, and many of the people like Frank were not kept on because no one knew how it was all going to work. He's also the photographer for the Savannah Music Festival, and he was back doing that this year after a break because of COVID as well. So he's known for his works on jazz and music, but he started going to Africa in 1974 and started going to Cuba in 1977, and has done a lot of photography in New Orleans and did a book on barbecue. He's a great barbecue chef and a great gumbo chef. He
Ooh.
carries his gumbo across the country. People ask for it. And he does barbecue wherever they want him to. I know he's done a lot of barbecue in Savannah during the music festival. I was there once and he was barbecuing. And because he was with Jazz at Lincoln Center and traveling around the world for years, his initial work was, I would say, centered on his African American and Native American roots. Once he started going to Asia and South America and was not particularly finding anything that had to do with his African American or Native American roots, he still was out there photographing. And so there's a large body of work around the world, which is really looking at other cultures and how they function. And of course, there are certain kinds of forms that interest him and certain subjects that interest him, and they repeat throughout the world. But he very much, I would say, believes in the universality of human experience more so than the differences. And so I think of him as a great champion of universal experience. And I think that's what makes the exhibition special, is that it both includes a very deep search for African roots and Caribbean roots, but also a deep search for humanity's connections. And he evolves his photography involved. There's a lot of black and white, gelatin silver, and then digital. And he did do color photography from the very beginning, but he didn't print it so much then because it was expensive. And so once digital came in, he started visibly doing more color photography. And he works at different sizes. He works in different media with the same image and believes, I think, very much as Jasper Zahn believes, if you change one thing, you change everything. And so if you change the size, you've changed your subject and your image. And if you change the medium, there are a few examples in the show. One is of an image in both gelatin silver and digital, so that you can see the differences. And there's only one where there's a cropped image, because he basically crops in the camera, but there's a very early image where he did crop. And so that is in there. But other than that, there's only one image of any subject. The wall text will have him discussing their meaning. And so I'm looking forward to seeing the show on the walls. And my other project is very print related, because the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation is doing, well, I mean, three really. There's a whole Lichtenstein print related thing too, which somehow the Lichtenstein is like my daily breath. And I don't think about it every day because it's there every day. And so certainly we're dealing with Lichtenstein prints and projects related to them. But for Frankenthaler Foundation, they've been distributing groups of prints to museums and galleries related to academic institutions. And the first round of those gifts, I guess, happened right before COVID. 10 institutions were selected to receive a gift of 10 prints that went across her career, plus a set of proofs for one of those prints, plus funding to do a project or a program or an exhibition related to this group of works of art. So, for example, Bowdoin University just did a show of Frankenthaler and an artist named Joe Sandeman, who, were the same generation and both had very different kinds of experimentation in their work. And the University of South Florida, Tampa, where Graphic Studio is, did an exhibition and a small catalog in which they reproduced the text I had written. I had done a Frankenthaler show at the gallery in 1993, which was a funny experience. It was supposed to celebrate the catalog raisonné of her prints, except about 6 months before the show was to open, we realized the catalog raisonné wasn't going to be finished. And so I wrote an essay and we put together a catalog, and it was a beautiful show. So anyway, the second group of gifts is now being organized. And so I'm in the process of organizing the next gift of 10 works for 10 institutions plus a group of proofs. And it's very interesting because in the first group, it was important to me that representation of each media was included and across the board chronologically. In this next group, I think I'm focusing on the different print shops she worked in, which sort of by definition will represent the various media. I don't know that we can fit every kind of media she worked in, but it will be, several different workshops. I mean, her primary places to work were ULA and Tyler Graphics, ULA at the beginning and Tyler Graphics at the end. And then she did a lot of woodcuts published by Pace. Her late work has a lot of woodcuts, and they're very complex and very beautiful, and someone in the Japanese style of thin layers of color.
Yeah, I think Yasu Shibata is the printer on most of those, right? From Pace, yeah. I think a group from the first round must have gone to the Spencer Museum at the University of Kansas, because Kate Meyer, the curator, used the funds to do a project, but it was through a class, an undergraduate class, because they're so heavily involved in teaching. Right. And she invited me to give a lecture to the class that was sort of setting the stage, the kind of 40s, 50s into Frankenthaler.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it was fun.
Well, she really reinvigorated interest in the woodcut, I would say, when she did her earliest woodcuts at ULAE, East and Beyond, and then some amazing things she also did at Tyler. So that's my other print-specific project. And, I love the prints. I think she's a really important printmaker. Her proofs can be totally fascinating. They're not in the sense that Johns' proofs from one print impact the proof from another print, so that made sense to me that his proofs be held pretty much together, whereas with Frankenthaler's proofs, I didn't think that was important. I had to really think that through. I mean, how to make the project make sense both for the institutions and for Frankenthaler's prints was what I gave a lot of thought to in the first round. And the second round, it's, how to make this group make sense and have an importance. I mean, I hadn't actually realized it, but somehow in 1987, there are so many prints and many print workshops. And I need to go back and do some thinking about, just what was going on in her life at that moment. But we were pretty close. She's an artist I miss a great deal because we were close. And while many people found her difficult, we managed to get along just fine. Whatever the difficulties were, we worked our way through them. And so it was great. But, there's nothing like discussing an exhibition about an artist with that artist. And some of them have a lot they want to discuss, and some of them have very little. When we did the John's Drawing Show in 1990 that Nan Rosenthal and I co-curated, Jasper came down and he essentially changed the installation of two works so that they would be reflecting, we had 2 ale cans and 2 coffee cans, Savarin cans, each on one wall. And then he wanted 1 ale can, 1 Savarin can, the other ale can, the other Savarin can. So if you collapse the walls, they would be mirroring each other. And so that was fascinating. And, he doesn't care to impact your point of view at all. He will correct things if you are doing something wrong, if you're inaccurate. Whereas many artists, do want to impact your point of view. And they're the interesting discussions. I found generally that we always come to a meeting place that usually whatever disagreements there are, the artist usually convinces me of 50% and I convince them of 50%. And in so doing, I learn a huge amount of how they think, which it's one of the great privileges of the work I've done all my life.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here thinking about you as a maker and as a curator, and thinking about how helpful that is when you're working with living artists, that you speak the same language, as it were, and thinking about curators and scholars who work on, 15th century or 16th century, and it's like a whole different thing, because you've got a set of facts, and that's all you'll ever get. Where you're in conversation, and it's like a whole different kind of curatorial practice. It's so
I
fascinating.
think that's true. What I think was really important for me was that I spoke the printer's language.
Exactly.
And so printers were always comfortable talking to me because they didn't have to explain their language. And I mean, I set up I set up two etching shops, actually. I set up an etching shop at Beaver College and an etching shop at the University of Pennsylvania, where I got my MFA. And I set up a screen printing shop at Beaver College because Benton Spruance had only taught lithography. Mm-hmm. And so when I got there and wanted to open the field a bit, I set up that workshop too. So I did pretty much know the language, and I found that very helpful. With artists, one of the things I think has always interested me is I kind of know what it's easy to do. And I find sometimes people are very impressed with things that are relatively easy to do if you know what you're doing. And so that's always been interesting, and I think useful to making judgments. I remember going into Alex Katz's studio, and I went to select a group of drawings for the National Gallery and had these vast landscapes. I don't know, they just filled the wall. And the first time I saw them, I thought, there's no way someone who doesn't have his years of experience could paint these pictures. I mean, his ability to physically handle the paint and swath. I mean, Frankenthaler always was the wrist and the arm. Well, Katz in these paintings was totally the arm and the body. They may have looked easy to someone, but they were really the result of profound, long, serious experience, and totally different than his small works, which I really love as well, which he's been doing all his life. And they're very beautiful, but a totally different way of thinking about paint. So, right. Yeah, and I suppose partly because I have always been making, my primary interest has always been process. I really want to know how things are made. I want to know what they're made with. Not necessarily how long it took, but, and I mean, Marin's thought of as a great spontaneous artist, but all of these drawings Marin did on plastic, on mylar, or similar to mylar. I don't remember when mylar was invented. And, they were used to make the same image again and again and again. It's not about spontaneity at all. And Roy's process is fascinating, where there'll be a drawing and it will be blown up or changed, or how that's done. And, that changed over the years as well. He's always thought of as a pop artist, but that took 7 years of his life. It was a long career before that and after that. His fame came at that moment, but there was so much after that people disregard. The same with Frankenthaler, Mountains and Sea. Well, she did a lot of other paintings, and it's now happening with the woodcuts, that the woodcuts are beautiful, but so are the etchings and so are the lithographs. And I keep thinking, boy, you could really do a beautiful show with no woodcuts at all. But everyone's doing shows of the woodcuts. So,
I find that there seems to be a prejudice somehow against technique and process, and that somehow focusing too much on that blocks you from getting to some larger meaning or something. But, some artist had an idea and it had to come out of theirs head through the hand. Like, the making is critical. Like, that's the only thing that really, it just amazes me when people are like, you talk too much about technique and process. I'm like, How is that possible?
Yeah, well, the medium is the message. That's a fairly
Right.
famous. It's not the only message, and it's one of the messages.
Right, right,
And,
right.
I think that stayed with us, and I think it still stays with us. And of course, now with all of the AI and I don't know what else that I don't understand, I don't actually know if that's changing it or expanding it. I think it's probably expanding it.
Remains to be seen, I think. Yeah.
I mean, any artist's work that's worth looking at, as far as I'm concerned, it has to be looked at on multiple layers. And one of them is how they're made, and another one is what's the content connecting to, and what are the metaphoric possibilities. And we have so much conversation now about cultural issues. Much of my early work was based on Indian and Persian miniatures, and I don't know if I'd be allowed to do that today without being severely criticized. And the idea that if you are not of a certain ethnicity, that your thoughts about work by an artist of that ethnicity are not useful. And it just seems to me that the more kinds of people that look at works of art, the more ideas, thought will be brought to those works of art. I don't know that if you're not of that ethnicity, you understand the historical importance within that tradition.
Right.
Certainly, I do not know the historical importance within the tradition of Indian and Persian miniature. I know a certain amount. I've read a certain amount, but I'm neither Indian nor Iranian. And I wouldn't argue that I know what an artist of that ethnicity knows, but that doesn't mean that my response is useless. And I think that's true for everybody and for all works of art, that the more experiences that are brought to them, the more we have to think about when we think about them, and we certainly need to read outside of our own realms. But, I've been writing about African American art since the 70s and been very connected with the Brandywine Workshop in Philadelphia since it was founded in 72, I think. And before that, I knew the founder, Alan Edmonds. And we've talked about art all of those years, but certainly from the time I did the Bearden Show, which is how I met Frank Stewart, because I needed to talk to him about Romare Bearden. There was the Bearden Show, and then there was the Norman Lewis Show, and then I did work on a Puryear Show, and I did work on several Archives of American Art interviews with African American artists and collectors, and now Frank Stewart. And I think all of these artists did say, I'm not only working for Black people, I am working for Black people. And it's very important to me that they understand and know my work. But all of them had a sense of the universality of humanity being important. So I guess I just have taken my charge from them. And they, Bearden did wonderful prints, and Lewis certainly did wonderful prints that I think were pretty underknown before my show. And obviously, Puryear's prints are well known and very, very beautiful. And the range of Frank Stewart's work needs to be better known. But they all have essentially said the same thing, and you can tell from their work that they have very definitely African American and African diasporic subjects, which are part of them, which only people who understand very intimately those traditions will understand in the way they understand them. But they do emanate other things to think about. And that's what seems to me to be so important. I don't know if it's a generational issue. I certainly have said many times that I think issues of language are very, very much generational, in the sense that I use language that means nothing to people who are in their 20s and 30s, and they use language that means nothing to me. Spend a lot of time to, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And great conversations. It's fabulous. I love those conversations.
Sure.
But if I didn't have people of that age in my life to talk to, there'd be a problem. I mean, I
Right.
wouldn't know what that generation means by such and such an issue. I mean, there was a wonderful conversation in Philadelphia last week. There was a piece by Theaster Gates unveiled on the Drexel campus in a conversation after the unveiling of the sculpture by Elizabeth Alexander of the Mellon Foundation and Theaster and two people from Drexel. And, it was just wonderful to hear his thinking about his work. He did a project at the Fabric Workshop, which is, of course, a whole other print facility in Philadelphia that's wonderful and highly experimental always. And he had done a project there a while ago. It was a marvelous conversation, but there certainly were generational differences in how they were talking and how someone, my age would be talking, I think. There aren't that many people my age around anymore.
I think you're doing pretty good, Ruth. So we've talked for more than an hour, so I want to ask you two last questions, which are, what advice do you have for both young artists and young curators who want to get into the field?
Well, I guess to both kinds of, with both intentions, the best advice I would give is to be yourself, find out who you are. Whatever you have to do to find that out, find out who you are and then be yourself. But things are changing so much with so much being done online. I've always felt the more primary material you can see in person, whether you're an artist or an art historian or a curator, the better. That you simply see more by seeing in person. And certainly there are so many exhibitions up now. It's so important. I mean, one of Frank Stewart's influences when he was in art school was Jack Whitten. And so much to see of Jack Whitten's work in recent years, which is wonderful, and how he made it is fascinating. But I think it's not so much being taught, it's being a sponge. I think the more you can absorb, the greater variety you can absorb. The more you can see, the more you can read. Always look for primary source material as much as you can, not only other people's opinions. And if you are taking other people's opinions, know as much as you can about those people so you know whether their opinions really are valuable. I mean, everyone has opinions, but I don't think they're all necessarily valuable.
Sure.
I mean, one of the best curators of my lifetime, and by best, I mean broadest, most flexible, most knowledgeable, is Richard Field, who, is 10 years older than I am, but I still think of him as my generation. And how many people do you know that have worked seriously on the 15th century and the 21st century? In the 18th century? I mean, nobody like Richard Field who has done that expansive work. I think each thing you do helps you think about the other things you do because you see contrasts. I've said many times that I did Frankenthaler and Lichtenstein shows at the same time. I mean, they weren't shown at the same time, but I was working on them at the same time. And there are no people who worked more differently than those two. And so each one of them highlighted what was different about them from the other one, which made the other one come into a stronger focus. And that's what interests me the most, is really getting into what makes each of us, no matter what we're doing, be us and offer what we can offer that nobody else can offer. And in some ways, I think that's true for all of us, that we all have something to offer that nobody else can offer because nobody else has had precisely the same experiences we have had. And so that would be, I guess, what I would say to young curators and young artists and young art historians.
Okay, that was a good answer. I thought you were going to say, young artists, please sign and date your work.
Well, that's another story. Yeah, all artists should sign and date their
Exactly.
work, but very few do.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's
but
true.
that gives you a lot to think about too. How does this associate with that? I mean, the sketchbooks of Roy Lichtenstein have been given circa dates by their relationship to so many other works of art, and it's been it's huge and time consuming, and it's not what everybody wants to do, but you learn a lot if you have to. Yeah, I mean, Larry dated, I don't think dated any drawing he ever did, and there are hundreds of them. So, yeah. Yeah, sign and date your drawings. If you don't want to sign them, at least date them.
Yeah, exactly.
We know who did them, but you just don't know when.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I appreciate that. Thank you for adding to my...
Okay. The other one I might add is that I actually need to write to Dick Field and ask him to come on the show. But when I was interviewing Tom Huck, he said that that Dick had shared all of these wonderful images he'd taken over the years of these 15th century, wood blocks and things, and that Dick finally confessed that he had never actually made a woodcut himself. And so he went to woodcut boot camp at Huck's farm and actually did it, which goes to your experience as a maker and a curator, that it would be instructive and probably a good thing for curators to go and try and learn how to do the thing they're the curator of.
I think most curators at some point or another try and do something, but I could be wrong about that. You'd know more about that than I do.
Oh, I don't think so.
Well, you would certainly know more than I. I mean, I've been surprised at print council meetings when we've been taken to workshops and so many people have said, I've never been in a lithography shop before.
Exactly.
I mean, they can be found in every city. There's no city that has an art school or an art program that doesn't have some kind of printing press, I don't think. I mean, perhaps there are, but I don't know of any.
Yeah, I think, the people that we worked with at the gallery, so many of them were artists, so that this idea that people didn't actually do that thing was probably not even in my mind at the time. But I have met at print council and elsewhere people who were like, I've never, I haven't made a lithograph myself, but I certainly watched it enough times. Although the chemistry is magic. I can't describe it. I don't know what the hell happens.
That's magic.
I have an episode in which Laura Einstein quotes you specifically as having said, the value of a work of art is not reflected in its price.
Right.
Does that sound like you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why people denigrate, not denigrate, why people pay less attention to prints. They ignore them. If they can afford a painting or a sculpture, they will feel that that's more important. And sometimes it may be, but I think in many instances, an artist's prints are hugely important, hugely not under any circumstances, but under many circumstances.
Yeah. Well, Ruth, thank you so much for coming on Platemark. It's been a delight catching up with you, and I know listeners will be fascinated to hear all your stories because you've had quite a career. So wonderful.
I've been very lucky.
Yeah.
I feel very lucky. And I still feel very lucky. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Platemark with my guest, Ruth Fine. She's a lovely person, and I enjoyed talking with her thoroughly. Thank you also, as always, to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music, and a thank you to Dan Fury of Extension Audio for mixing the sound on these puppies. It's super helpful. I have no idea what I'm doing, so thank you, Dan. As you know, any images that Ruth and I talked about will be over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com, and you can go over there and hit the support and donate button, help me keep the lights on. I think that's it. All right, we will see you next time.